Hey there, and welcome to the Super Daddy Club, where we're all about parenting for the next generation. Make sure to check out our Patreon for exclusive content and behind-the-scenes insights. Swing by our YouTube channel for bite-sized clips of our best moments and live episodes. Drop your comments and let us know what's on your mind. Your thoughts matter, and together, let's take this show to new heights.
A lot of people have been hearing, for example, that they need to do 10,000 steps per day. That's been the magic number for years. And that's totally been based on a Japanese marketing technique that came out in 1964. It had no scientific basis.
Welcome to Super Daddy Club Podcast. I'm your host, Lando. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Carl Lavie. Dr. Carl, welcome to Super Daddy Club Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Lando.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Carl Lavie is a distinguished leader in cardiology celebrated for his groundbreaking contributions to medical research and education. With over 1,600 medical publications to his name and an impressive H-index of 151, Dr. Lavie's work is widely cited and respected globally. He has also authored 2 cardiology textbooks and serves on 40 editorial boards, including prestigious journals such as the Journal of American College of Cardiology and the American Journal of Cardiology. Dr. Lavie currently holds prominent position as professor of medicine, medical director of cardiac rehabilitation and prevention, and director of the Exercise Laboratories at the John Ochsner Heart and Vascular Institute within the Ochsner Clinical School, part of the University of Queensland School of Medicine in New Orleans. Additionally, he serves as associate editor and cardiovascular section editor of the Mayo Clinic Proceedings and editor-in-chief of Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases. Dr. Lavie's career began at LSUMC in New Orleans, where he attended medical school before completing his internal medicine training at Ochsner and his cardiology fellowship at the Mayo Clinic. He is also the author of the influential book, The Obesity Paradox. Within your book, it is the obesity paradox, but you also address the thin paradox, which is 2 sides of the same coin in a sense, but I am of the thin paradox profile that you describe.
Yeah, so Lendo, first of all, I'm seeing you through the computer, but I don't think you're a classic example of the lean paradox because I can tell you have muscle. And we'll get to that during this conversation because that's a big difference because the real lean paradox is probably people who are really thin and physically weak and don't have a lot of muscular strength. And those people might even be worse off than people who are a little bit heavier. You know, the book came out in 2014, so it's been a decade later. You know, there's been a lot happening in the last decade, but still, I don't think it's totally changed. I think the obesity paradox is still alive. And the first papers started coming out about that in around the year 2000, and people found it very surprising when that came out. In fact, I was doing a research study. There's a test called cardiopulmonary stress testing. You measure gas exchange during exercise. And we were doing a project because with congestive heart failure, weakened hearts, many years ago, the oxygen consumption, or peak VO2, which was the best test to measure exercise capacity, was being used to stratify patients who needed a heart transplant. And we thought back in the late 90s when we were collecting this data, my colleagues, particularly Dr. Mandeep Mehra, who's at Harvard, and Dr. Richard Milani, who was with me for many years here at Ochsner, they really thought that if we corrected peak VO2 for lean body mass instead of total weight, total mass, that we'd get a better predictor of prognosis. And it would be better than just a simple peak VO2. And the reason they thought that was that the fat does not have much metabolism or doesn't have much blood perfusion. We know now that the fat is a very, very important endocrine organ and it has many important features, but it really doesn't get the blood flow and use up the metabolic rate the way muscle does. And so when we did this study, we had to get percent body fat. So when we were collecting our data, my cardiology fellow at the time brought me the data, And it showed that the people who died during follow-up had a lower BMI and a lower percent body fat than those who survived. And right when I saw that data back in probably 1999, my first thought was, oh, he had just reversed the columns. That can't be true. And so I said, go back and, make sure, I think you get the columns reversed. And of course he hadn't. I mean, the data was perfectly sound and it was exactly like he had showed me. And so I was surprised because I would have thought that the heavier would have done worse. And it turned out they did better. And we actually published that paper showing that the lean adjusted peak VO2 was a much better predictor of who was going to die and who really probably needed transplant. So we got that paper published in a top journal called Journal American College of Cardiology, which is our leading cardiology journal in the United States, in 2000. But then we tried to publish the paper about showing that the percent body fat was actually, for every 1% increase in body fat, we showed that there was a 13% lower mortality in these heart failure patients. And we had a hard time getting this published. It took, many journals rejected it. Many journals didn't believe it. And it's turned out now the paper finally got published in the American Journal of Cardiology a year or two later. And it's gotten cited like 700 times in the literature by other authors. It's been a very, very successful paper. But that got me into the obesity paradox. And likewise, if 25 years ago, I would have been sitting with two patients who had just had heart attacks, and one had a BMI of 22 and the other one had a BMI of 32, I would have thought that the BMI of 22 would have done better, would have had a better prognosis. And in fact, on paper, the BMI of 22 looked healthier. They had lower blood pressure, they had lower triglycerides, they had higher HDL, they had lower blood sugars, they had less inflammation, lower levels of C-reactive protein in the blood than the BMI of 32. Yet, the studies in the last 2 decades are repeatedly showing that the BMI of 32 is having a better prognosis than the BMI of 22. And that's what basically became the obesity paradox. Sometimes when I talk about this, I'm often concerned that clinicians or lay public are going to get the idea that it's good to be heavier, it's good to be obese. And that's not what we're saying at all. In fact, we know for a fact that people who gain more weight get more cardiovascular disease. And they often have a higher cardiovascular mortality and a higher mortality. So we're not saying that it's healthier to be heavier. In fact, I say repeatedly that the perfect scenario would be for a person to remain lean and fit from young age to old age. And that's hardly what happens in the United States or really most of the world. But what we are finding, though, is that once the patients develop heart disease, that's like things like congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, myocardial infarctions, heart attacks, need to get bypass surgery or stents, or people with many cardiovascular diseases, that the overweight and the obese with those diseases are having a better prognosis. And that's what the obesity paradox is. The obesity paradox is not saying it's better to be obese. It's just saying that among patients with comorbid conditions or with cardiovascular diseases, that the overweight and obese are having a better prognosis. And we also know that's the case for other conditions. People who are dialysis patients, people on, chronic kidney disease, many patients that, years ago with HIV, many patients with other chronic diseases are having a better prognosis with a little bit more weight than do the leaner patients. And again, that's in a nutshell what the obesity paradox is.
Now, just for some clarification, when I started reading about obesity, one of the things that I stumbled on right away was the body mass index, or metric that we use to be able to quantify who's overweight or obese. It seems as though, why haven't we been able to come up with a more accurate system to help us understand this? Because later on, if we get an opportunity to, once you start going through the benefits of fat, for example, and just from a layperson speaking, it seemed a little bit obvious that, hey, there's more than just the body mass index whenever we're dealing with fat.
Yeah. So from a clinical standpoint, most of the world, when the patient comes in, you get a height and weight. And that simple formula gets you the body mass index. And body mass index, of course, is a metric that isn't just fat. So if the body mass index goes up, it doesn't mean that it's all fat, because muscle is part of the body mass index as well. And so our middle linebackers in the National Football League, many of them would be considered obese because their body mass index is high. And obviously they have very little body fat. They're all muscle.
Mm-hmm.
So the body mass index is not a perfect metric. However, in an adult population in the United States and most of the world, for the most part, it's pretty accurate, because not too many people who are 60 years old, who have BMIs of 32, 33, 35, 37, not too many of them are solid muscle. Most of them have a lot of body fat. Still, though, your point is, if two people both have a BMI of 32, even in the regular adult population, not counting the NFL linebackers, but two people have a BMI of 32, one could have a lot more fat and the other one could have a lot more muscle than the other person. They both generally have a fair amount of body fat, but body distributions are different between people. And likewise, someone could have a BMI of 24 and have a lot of body fat and have very little muscle. That's really bad. That's a really bad situation when you're thin and you don't have much muscle and you have a lot of body fat. That's even worse for the person who has, a little bit higher BMI, who's got more muscle, is actually better off than that thin person who's almost all body fat.
Mm-hmm.
So again, BMI is not a perfect metric. And there's many other things, but generally in most data banks, and when most people see patients in the office, what they have is the height and the weight. Now, you could easily add some simple things to that. The easiest thing to add would be a waist circumference. Waist circumference is not a hard measurement to do. It's just not typically done in most of the world. It is done now in many research studies. Now, from a research standpoint, you can even do way better. You can do scans and measure all kinds of body fats. You can do DEXA scans and get really accurately lean body mass, and you can get muscle mass, and et cetera. Again, most people certainly don't have that information when they see in patients in the office. Most patients themselves have no idea, those numbers. Many people know their waist size, at least from what size pants they wear. They may not have actually done a measurement of their waist, but they know that they're in a 36 or 38 or 40 or 42 or 44 pants. So there are other metrics, but most big data banks don't even have the waist circumference. Some of them do. And some of them obviously have, more sophisticated tests of body composition. But certainly most people in their clinicians' offices and most patients themselves really only know their height and weight. And some of them don't even know that, but they can, that's usually measured when somebody walks in the office. One of the first things that gets tested is the height and the weight and the blood pressure and the pulse. So that's usually in most of the records. And so it is a pretty simple, and again, even though it's got deficiencies, for the most part, like I said, in most people in the world, in the United States, as they get older, the body mass index is very reflective in general of how much adiposity or fat one has. Again, with some deviation, some people have a little bit more than others, but generally when somebody has a 35 BMI, they have a lot of body fat. Some have more than others, but they have a lot.
Okay. Now, the overall numbers globally for when we're looking at the rise in obesity over the years, they're quite scary, especially that they're continuing to climb and also affecting younger and younger population. And I don't know if the rate of how fast it's climbing has been calculated or...
So right now, the stats in the United States suggest that 75% of adults between ages 20 years and 80 years in adults, 75% are either considered overweight, meaning BMI is over 25, or obese. And the obese number is something like 42% of adults in the United States have BMIs over 30. Okay. Then what's even more scary is right now, about 9% of the adult population, 1 in 11 adults are having BMIs of 40 and higher. That's considered severe or class 3 obesity. We used to use the term morbid obesity. I think we try not to use that term now because it sounds mean.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're degrading the heavier person. But again, it's often called class 3 obesity or severe obesity. But that number is actually increasing at a higher rate than obesity per se. So I think that's a very scary statistic. The other scary statistic is that, and I've published papers on the increasing prevalence of obesity in kids and adolescents and how much cardiometabolic disease that's producing. So I'm going to be 66 this year. But when I was a kid, there were hardly any really heavy kids. Every now and then a kid would be a little bit chubby, but not really very heavy. And that was because when we were kids, the kids were out playing all day. They came home from school, immediately went outside to play. During the summer times, you're outside the whole day. And now that is not the case. The kids are not outside like they used to be. They're very often on their phones and they're on their computers and they're on video games and TVs. And maybe they're having more fast food too, but I think it's probably more the lack of physical activity than even the fast food because, people ate a lot of calories back decades ago too.
Yeah.
It's more, I think, the very marked fall that's happening in physical activity over the last 5 decades with industrialization. And now with all the devices and smartphones and laptops and iPads that the kids are on constantly. And so the increasing prevalence of obesity in kids and adolescents, I think is really scary because if you look at now, the 60-year-olds in the United States who are so heavy, and they were good weights when they were kids. So now if you got kids who are already pretty heavy and they're already getting into high school and college, and they're already very heavy. How are they going to be when they're 60 years old?
Exactly.
Again, I don't know that there's going to ever be enough bariatric surgery and semaglutide to go around to take care of the increasing obesity. So I do think that that's a really scary situation, the increasing obesity. And again, we're talking about the obesity paradox, making it sound like, at least in people who have bad heart disease, that the overweight and obese are doing a little bit better. But I think on the flip side, it's very scary that the increase in weight and obesity in the whole population, starting with kids and adolescents, is going to lead to so much more cardiometabolic disease and so much more diabetes and so much more heart disease, not to mention cancers and other things, in the long run, which is going to put a major, major toll to health of the entire population.
So it remains that when you're overweight or obese, you're more likely to contract some of these chronic conditions. But if I understand correctly, once people have contracted these particular conditions and we compare them with their counterpart in terms of body mass index on the opposite scale, that's where we're seeing that they're faring better. But we're still going to see this increase in development and contraction of these conditions, essentially.
I think that's exactly correct. And some people will say, well, why does the person who has a BMI of 24 end up doing better? And I think that we honestly don't know exactly the reason for that. But I do think that, for example, the person who finishes high school weighing 160 pounds and who, like many decades ago, when I was in school, many people finished their high school, they were like 160 pounds. Now they're 65 years old and they weigh 240 pounds. They've gained 80 pounds over the last basically 40 years, which is only 2 pounds a year. It's not like 20 pounds a year, it's 2 pounds a year. But that person, they gained those 80 pounds. And with those 80 pounds, their sugars went up, their blood pressures went up, their triglycerides went up, their HDL went down, their inflammation went up. And that person probably would have not developed the heart disease in the first place had they remained 160 pounds over. And again, hardly anybody remains 160 pounds, but had they only gained 15 pounds and gone up to 175 instead of 240, that person probably wouldn't have developed the heart disease in the first place. Whereas the person who maintains a low weight and still develops the same disease, they probably are getting the disease for a different reason. They're probably getting it for genetic predisposition, more so than their risk factors. Then that person ends up having a worse prognosis. And that's what I refer to as the lean paradox or the thin paradox, is that the person who is thin, who gets the heart disease to begin with, is probably different. And then when you have the thin person who's physically weak and doesn't have much muscle, they're really going to have a bad prognosis. Now, you say that the higher person. So when people gain weight, typically when adults go from 160 in high school to 240 at 65 years old, they gain mostly fat. But when you're gaining weight, you are also gaining some muscle. Because not all of the weight you gain is fat, some of it is in muscle. And in fact, when a person carries around every day all that extra weight, and they have to walk around all day with extra weight, that also builds some muscle. Now, again, they may be mostly fat, but they gained 80 pounds, but maybe only 10 or 15 of it was muscle. But the person who is thin, often has, in our society, very little muscle. And that's what I was saying at the beginning. I can tell just from the picture of you on the computer that you have some muscle. And you told me the type of work you do. So it's probably building muscle. Maybe you do weights and have some muscle. But when people lose weight, the same thing happens. When people go from a high weight to a low weight, if they do a massive diet, no matter what their diet is, and they lose 50, 60, 70 pounds, they mostly are losing fat, but they're also losing muscle. And unless they're doing a lot of physical activity, and particularly unless they're doing resistance exercise that's keeping their muscles from declining too, they're probably going to lose a number of pounds of muscle. So very often in our society, the thinner people, especially if they're not physically active and if they're not, physically fit, they end up being weak. And many of those people get sarcopenia and cachexia. And so, we know for a fact that the underweight, and typically in the United States and the world, those who have BMIs under 18.5, they generally do bad for everything. But in our country, I think that very often the BMI of 22, 23, in a country where that's not the norm anymore, the norm is to be considerably heavier. Very often the 22 and the 23 BMI is a person that's really very thin and weak. And again, there's exceptions, the people that are winning marathons and, who obviously their weight is low. They have hardly any body fat. They're totally muscle. But again, many of the people who are thin in the United States right now are not necessarily physically active and end up having very little muscle mass. That puts them at risk for many diseases, including increased cardiovascular disease if they have already underlying heart disease.
It's also fascinating. So the biggest culprit is lack of physical activity for the younger demographics, you're saying. And we're seeing that across the spectrum, if I understand correctly, with the different demographics of age. And what about like sugar, salts? One of my earlier questions was what's going on with caloric intake today versus yesterday?
Yeah. So, Lindo, we published a paper years ago, it's about a decade ago, Ed Archer and I, looking at 45-year trends in women's household management caloric expenditure, which is a fancy way of saying housework in women. And we showed, as you'd expect, very marked declines. And that paper actually got a lot of publicity. And it wasn't all good publicity. I'll give you an example. There was pictures of me in a major newspaper And the caption under it said, "Women are getting fat because they're not doing enough housework." So you can imagine how that went over. It was on Fox News 3 times in one night. It was on Jay Leno's, one of his last monologues. And so, again, people could easily make fun about talking about housework and women. But we basically showed that the women over 5 decades are burning about 1,800 calories less per week than they were 5 decades ago. It took a lot of energy to keep your house up 5 decades ago. And now it's all machines and, pushing buttons, and you don't have to move too much to do all the work. Okay, well, so there's usually about 100 calories burned for every mile traveled by foot. That would mean the typical woman today would have to be walking or jogging about 18 more miles per week to be burning the calories that she was 5 decades earlier. And not only does that mean that calories are adding to weight, but, a big part of physical fitness is because of energy expenditure. That you typically, the more physical activity you do, the more fit you are. There is a genetic component of fitness, but there's certainly, most of fitness is through physical activity. So not only is that causing the woman to gain weight, but it's also affecting their physical fitness. Now, no question, many people blame the obesity epidemic on the sugary beverages, the Coca-Cola, the Pepsi-Cola, the Dr. Pepper, the Barks root beer.
Mm-hmm.
They blame it on the fast foods, McDonald's and, Burger King, Taco Bell, etc. And there's no question that if you're going to be burning a lot less calories, you really do need to be taking in less sugar and less carbs. And for many of those people burning fewer calories, and as well as for people who have high sugars in their blood or, high triglycerides, they'd be much better taking in more protein and even good fats like olive oil and nuts and, and fish type of oils than sweets and carbohydrates. The problem, though, I don't think is fundamentally that. I think the fundamental problem is the marked fall in physical activity. Because if someone's physical activity was very high, like it typically used to be decades ago, it wouldn't be so bad to be taking in some sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's still nobody needs to be taking in massive excessive amounts of sugar. Even if you're doing a lot of physical activity, you still don't need to be drinking 5 Cokes a day. But if somebody was doing a heavy amount of physical activity, if they were drinking a sugary Coke a day, they would still be pretty healthy. Mm-hmm. That Coke is not going to offset all of the physical activity they're doing. Now, again, I'm all for, if you're going to be having a Coke, why not have a Coke Zero? Why not have a water with lemon juice or lime juice instead of the Coke Zero even? I'm not trying to push soft drinks on anyone, and particularly sugary soft drinks. But I don't think that's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem has been the marked decline in physical activity. And so decades ago, you didn't have to go to the gym to get physical activity. You got it naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Now people are not getting it naturally for the most part. So you have to purposely do leisure time physical activity. You need to go to the gym. You need to go out and ride a bicycle or swim or do elliptical machines, Nordic tracks, etc. Because you're not getting it in your natural environment. For most people's occupation, they're not getting the physical activity. So they need to purposefully go out and be physically active. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't maybe the case decades ago.
It's a weird message because it seems as though everybody's always like, yeah, you need to exercise, you need to, be healthy, try and become more fit. But I don't know how well it sets in people's minds. For me, when you were talking about it from the perspective of sitting down is killing us, that was a big eye-opening moment.
Sitting is the new smoking.
Sitting is the new smoking. Sorry, I messed that up. That was really profound because I'm also a student. So I literally go from sitting down in class all day to sitting down when I'm eating to just not moving. I actually say that I used to be a better dancer. I used to be a good dancer when I was young, but then my hips got stiff just sitting down all day studying and whatnot. But can you elaborate at it from that standpoint and also talk about how we evolve in contrast to that? Because we evolve to be agile. It gave us a competitive edge, but we don't need that anymore, it feels like.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, our ancestors had to do a lot of it. The hunters and gatherers, they had to go out and work to get their food. They had to go out and work to take care of their housing and their habitat to protect themselves. And now people need to do very little physical activity to survive. I mean, in the natural environment, you can work and you can come home and you sit in front of the computer and you sit in front of your TV and you can get through the days now with very little physical activity. You can park right next to your office or your school, and you can easily get through the day with just a few thousand steps. And many people are getting very few steps. And then not only are they getting very few steps, the amount of sitting can be 12, 14 hours a day. So it's one thing even if you're going to be sitting in front of the computer, you got to get up every 30 minutes. And even if it's just for 30 seconds or 1 minute to move around, because just the sitting is very bad. We know from statistics that if people do a bunch of physical activity a day, let's say if they go out for a 30, 45-minute jog, a fast walk, that does protect them from sitting the rest of the day. The perfect scenario, though, would be to do the physical activity, but also avoid the very prolonged sitting. It's one thing if you sit 6 to 8 hours a day, but if you're sitting 12 and 14 hours a day, that's very bad. And so the more you sit you offset even some of the physical activity. And again, the perfect would be for people to sit a little bit less and be physically active, for part of the day. And when you are with the sitting would be to at least get up very often during the prolonged sitting to try to get the sitting time, or, for example, to be studying standing up or be studying, watching the TV or looking at the computer. You don't have to be sitting. You could put the computer in a way or in a position where you could be standing up. And at least that would be better. Mm-hmm. But I do think that the biggest problem, though, is that the physical activity is so low, and that's causing a big reduction in fitness. And even this applies to the obesity paradox, because we've got studies that show, and I've been involved with publishing studies in coronary heart disease, that people who have blocked arteries and heart attacks and stents and bypasses, as well as congestive heart failure, that the obesity paradox really only applies to the unfit. If someone has got a good level of fitness, their prognosis is generally quite good, regardless of what they weigh. But among the unfit, the people who have very low levels of fitness, that's where the heavier are doing better than the thinner. And it's probably because the thinner who are unfit, probably not only are they unfit with cardiorespiratory fitness, meaning how far they can run on a treadmill, etc., but that probably means they're also very low on muscular fitness, that they probably have low muscle mass. And so the combination of low weight, low muscle mass, low fitness is a very dangerous combination. Probably for total health, but that's particularly unhealthy for people who already have morbid conditions like heart disease or kidney disease or lung disease or, HIV or many conditions now that are being shown to have an obesity paradox.
Now, can you tell us about how the male versus the female body is going to accumulate fat as a part of, on one side, the natural aging process versus a disease process? As a dad, I have a bit of a belly that I've been accumulating. And also we feel as though, men gain weight whenever they have a child, whenever we start getting older. And it's hard for me to fully understand, where does it start to become unhealthy? Where does it start to become bad? And if maybe from there we can start going into what are the causes of the obesity paradox?
So we do know that, for example, women do naturally have a little bit more body fat than men. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of women that have way lower fat than men and vice versa. But as a general rule, the population of women have higher percentage of body fat. So we typically define high fat in men as above 25% body fat. And we typically define high body fat in women as above 35% body fat. Now, when people gain weight, the two genders gain weight in different positions. The men typically, as you just mentioned, gain more abdominal fat. and the women may gain more fat in their hips and their buttocks. But there are a lot of different forms of fat. And so from a simplistic standpoint, the two types of fat are subcutaneous fat. That's the fat that you visually see, under the skin if you pinch your skin. And then the other kind of fat is visceral fat, the fat around the organs. Subcutaneous fat may not be aesthetically pleasing because it may not make you look good in your Speedo bathing suit or when you look at yourself in the mirror. But subcutaneous fat is actually generally protective from the health standpoint. Whereas it's visceral fat, the fat around the organs, which produces all the bad chemicals, the bad cardiometabolic disease, increasing inflammation. And it's the fat around the abdominal organs, it's fat around the liver, it's fat around the heart, the pericardial fat. And many of those bad fat stores are the problem for cardiometabolic disease. So all fat is not created equally. Different forms of fat have different risks. Some of them may just make you not look as pretty as you want to look, where other forms of fat is actually producing much more harm to your health. The problem is, though, and two different people could gain 80 pounds. Generally, when people gain 80 pounds, they gain a lot of bad fat and maybe some good fat. But two individuals might have a different proportion of the two. But generally, when people gain a lot of weight, it's not all good fat. It's not all subcutaneous fat. They're getting fat around the organs too. One may get more than the other. So again, we can be, in research studies, really precise about measuring. If you do scans of people, you can measure their liver fat, you can measure the fat around the organs, you can measure the pericardial fat around the heart, you can measure the neck fat, and then you can measure muscle mass. But from a practical standpoint, when people gain a lot of weight, they generally are gaining a bunch of bad fat.
And why is that?
And
sorry to cut you off.
So the perfect scenario, again, after you've already gained 80 pounds, then you could start caring about, how much is it hurting you, your triglycerides and your sugar and your blood pressure and your inflammation, and trying to correct that as much as you can with physical activity and exercise and at least getting fit. So at least if the person who's heavier at least gets fit, not only will a physical activity make you possibly lose a few pounds, but it'll get you fit, which makes your prognosis so much better. But it also helps some of the cardiometabolic disease. But obviously, the person who's gained a lot of weight that gets all that cardiometabolic disease, there are things one can do to treat the blood pressure and treat the lipid abnormalities and treat the blood sugar and lessen the inflammation. So there are treatments medically that we can counteract some of the adverse effects of obesity. Now, again, in a perfect world, everybody would remain thin, cardiorespiratory fit, and muscular fit throughout their lifespan, from kids to young ages. And people, if we had all the people in the society, if the kids started physical activity at very young ages and continued it all through their life, we wouldn't have this epidemic like we have now of obesity and sedentary lifestyle. And that would be in a perfect scenario. And again, I think we do need efforts to try to at least lessen the blow that's happening right now. But the fact is, we know that there's so high prevalence of sedentary lifestyle and obesity that it's already happened. It's not just a matter of, we can start trying to prevent it in school kids right now, but it's already happened to the adults. Yeah. So we have to attack this in many different directions. And again, a way to attack it is really to try to increase the physical activity and the fitness in all individuals. Even if it doesn't make people get thin, at least it'll increase their fitness, which makes their prognosis so much better. And it'll prevent further weight gain. So the person who's got a BMI of 32, yeah, you'd like to get their BMI down to 27, 28. But it would be a win if you keep that person who has a BMI of 32 from going to 35 and 38, which then makes their prognosis so much worse. So again, we have to fight little battles to try to attack this in many different directions. And again, I do think for many people, it is easier for them to increase their physical activity than for them to change and be on a diet for their whole life. I think many people find it easier to increase their walking and try to do a 30-minute walk, every day, try to get, 8 or 9,000 steps instead of 2,500. I think that is easier for many people than lifelong changing their diet. Now, no question, I think that people, if they do a short-term diet, many people are very successful with short-term diets. They lose a lot of weight if they really stick to whatever diet they go on, whether it's a sugar buster diet or a keto diet. Many diets will make you join Jenny Craig or you do Weight Watchers. I mean, people can lose a bunch of weight. The issue is that many of those people who lose 30, 40, 50 pounds on vigorous diets, they go off of it and gain the weight back. But one thing they could do if they were doing physical activity and exercise, not only would that be helping them prevent further weight gain and weight regain after they've done a diet to lose weight, but it also would be improving their physical fitness, which would go a long way for decreasing their risk of future major diseases.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak about the metabolically healthy versus unhealthy? Because that is a demarcation that explains a lot of these paradoxes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. There's a term called metabolically healthy obese, and that would be the person who has a high weight, maybe meets criteria for obesity, but doesn't have a high blood sugar. Their blood pressure's okay, their triglycerides okay, they don't have high inflammation in the blood, their blood sugar's normal. That would be a person who's got metabolic healthy obesity. So they actually do way better than the person who's got metabolically unhealthy obesity. In fact, they even do better in general than the person who's got metabolically unhealthy normal weight, because it's probably the metabolic abnormality which is actually worse than the weight, at least for getting hardening of the arteries and atherosclerosis. We know that for causing congestive heart failure and weakening the heart muscle itself, the weight matters even if you're metabolically healthy. Even if you're metabolically healthy, the weight is putting toll. Mm-hmm. But most of the studies of metabolically healthy obese show that if you follow those people long enough, many of them become metabolically unhealthy. And that's because they gain more weight. Mm-hmm. So there's not too many people that maintain metabolically healthy obesity. Now, the exception of that is the person who's doing a lot of physical activity and has a good fitness. They really do look like they have a very good long-term prognosis. But the person who's not physically active and fit often gains more weight over time. And then that leads them to becoming not only putting a strain on their heart, that leads to congestive heart failure and atrial fibrillation, things that are in epidemic proportions now in the United States and world, but it's also leading to further weight gain. Mm-hmm. And when with the further weight gain, they get metabolic complications. Instead of being metabolically healthy, their sugar starts going up, their blood pressure starts going up, their triglycerides go up, their level of inflammation in the blood goes up. And so they end up not maintaining the metabolic healthiness over time.
Now, what about the metabolically unhealthy and thin? What is going on with that category?
So it's probably the metabolic unhealthiness that leads to the particularly atherosclerosis and the hardening of the arteries that leads to blocked arteries and fatty streaks that happen very early and late. So first of all, that person, for one, their weight might be low, so they might be considered normal weight, but they may have very high body fat, and the body fat is leading to more cardiometabolic disease. They also, though, could have a genetic susceptibility to getting metabolic abnormalities. If their BMI is 22, they might not get a high sugar. But when their BMI goes up to 24, which is still considered a good BMI, just that going up from 22 to 24 makes their sugar go up. Mm-hmm. So some people are more genetically susceptible to getting metabolic abnormalities. And it does look like the metabolic abnormalities, the blood pressure, the triglycerides, the sugar, the inflammation in the blood, probably are more important for causing at least atherosclerosis, which is, probably the leading type of, cardiovascular disease. The metabolic unhealthiness leads to this even more so than the weight. Mm-hmm. And so We want people to avoid the high weight because the high weight, even if a lot of the weight is muscle, the high weight does put a strain on the heart and leads to more congestive heart failure and more atrial fibrillation. But it looks like if you maintain metabolic healthiness, you're at least preventing the atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries.
Mm-hmm. Would you be able to dive into mitochondrial health and how it's related to all of this here? Because what we've been learning on this platform is there's a connection in between the food we're eating and the performance of the mitochondria. I've heard about diabetes being referred to as a disease of the mitochondria, which is not usually referred to in such a way by that definition.
Yeah. So almost everything in the body happens at the mitochondrial level. That's where all the ATP and phosphocreatinine and everything is. And inside the cells is where all the action is happening. Certainly, there is a lot of genetics that are involved with mitochondria, but physical activity can end up affecting the mitochondria. And that's where, for example, dietary intakes, if the diet is very bad, that can end up affecting the mitochondria. So high sugar intakes, which then lead to many things happening, and having maybe foods that have high oxidation and other constituents maybe can affect the mitochondria. The mitochondria is involved in almost every body function. It's involved in cancers and cardiovascular disease. The problem is that I don't think many people right now, maybe in the future we'll be able to know, we don't know the details of individuals' mitochondria. There's not really a mitochondrial test. You can do tests of endothelial function, which is the endothelium is the cells that coat the blood vessels. They have mitochondria too. You can do endothelial function tests, but most people can't get inside their mitochondria and study the mitochondria. So what we end up being able to study is things like we can study blood sugar and blood pressure and triglycerides and lipids, and we can measure inflammation. Those are things that, and we can do weights and waist circumferences, et cetera. But we can't really get inside the mitochondria of an individual or a population and know. And again, we do know for sure that some people have better genetics than others. Genetics do play a role in many diseases.
Would you be able to also tell us about the different type of exercises that we engage in? Because how much is too much? How much is enough? What should be the guideline for how long we're sitting down versus how long we're trying to walk? If you can shed some light on that.
So right now, the national recommendations are that adults should be doing about 150 minutes per week of moderate physical activity. That would be things like walking and slow bike riding, et cetera. Or 75 minutes a week of vigorous activity. That would be more like jogging or, riding bicycles fast, harder exercise, or combinations of that. And that most adults should be doing 1 to 2 times per week of resistance or muscle exercise. I had a paper, the guidelines say twice a week, but I had a paper years ago that showed that just 1 time a week of resistance exercise looked like it produced maximal benefits. That's like doing some weight training or hand grip exercises, et cetera. We do know, for example, I published a paper on runners years ago that showed that we studied 55,000 people, 13,000 runners and 42,000 non-runners, and followed them on average for 10 to 15 years. And we showed, of course, the runners did way better. But we also showed that when you looked at the runners and you divided the runners into dosing, times per week, minutes per week, how many miles per week, we showed that the lowest dose runners, those who were in the bottom quintile of dose, had the same benefits from a health standpoint as did the higher dose runners. Now, the higher dose runners probably could do better in the race, but it looks like from a health standpoint, the benefits were happening at a very low level. As little as 1 to 2 times running per week, running less than 52 minutes per week, running only 1 to 2 times per week, running less than 6 miles per week. They got the same benefit as those who were running more from a mortality standpoint and cardiovascular mortality. And so it does look like when you're doing higher intensity exercise like running, that the more and more you do, you reach your maximum potential, your maximum effect at a fairly low level. Whereas if you're doing more moderate exercise, you might need to be doing a little bit more. But generally, the more and more you do, you don't continue to get additional benefit. A lot of people have been hearing, for example, that they need to do 10,000 steps per day. That's the magic number for years. And that's totally been based on a Japanese marketing technique that came out in 1964. It had no scientific basis. I've actually reviewed papers recently and wrote editorials that's showing that the maximum benefits from the steps are happening at between 7,100 and 8,800 steps per day. So well less than the 10,000 steps per day. It certainly doesn't look like if you do 15,000 steps that you get any additional benefit. So again, they showed in a paper in JACC last year that you start getting benefits at between 2,500 and 3,000 steps per day. And then doing more, going up to 7,000 to 8,800 steps per day, you maximize out. I do think that you can get benefits. You don't have to do super high. So somebody does not have to go out and do hard workouts. They don't need to be doing, 3 hours. In fact, I also published a paper that showed that if you're looking at sports activity, the maximum effect was between 2.5 and 4 hours per week. Whereas that those who did 10 hours per week appeared to not only lose the benefit, but may have actually having a counteractive effect. And I don't want to make too much over the over-exercise. I don't think we're having a problem in the country and the world with over-exercise. There's only a few people out there that are doing marathons and triathlons. And again, do they need to be doing that for their health? And the answer would be no. You don't need to be doing marathons and triathlons and ultra marathons to be healthy. In fact, there may be even some counter productivity to that. You don't get additional benefits. You might actually be getting some harm. I don't try to discourage the heavy exercises too much because many of the heavy exercises, if you think about it, they have to be pretty healthy to be able to go out there and do a marathon and to be able to go out there and do these hard events. Mm-hmm. So I'm more worried about not the excessive exercise. And again, the person who's doing those heavy exercises, they're not doing it for health. They're doing it for competition, for camaraderie, for ego, for fun. People jump off of mountains. They don't and jump off of cliffs and race boats and race cars. They're not doing that for health. They're doing it for other reasons. So the benefits of exercise on health occur at much lower levels. And so generally, you really don't need to be doing more than 30, 45 minutes per day to get maximum health benefits. And if you're doing harder exercise, you get the maximum health benefits at probably well lower levels than that. Like running, you probably maximize out, at very low levels. Doing it just a couple of times per week, doing, well less than 10 miles per week of running, you maximize out the benefits. Now, you might burn more calories if you do more. You might prevent more weight gain. You might be able to eat a little bit more if you burn more calories. But from a health standpoint, you're getting the benefits of exercise at pretty low levels. Mm-hmm. And so if we could get people to just go out there and do modest levels of exercise, and it could just be a 30-minute walk a day, on most days, and then try to avoid sitting for more than 8 hours per day. Or at least if you're sitting for more than 8 hours a day, at least get up every 30 to 45 minutes and be up for 30 seconds to a minute. Go walk around your office or walk around your house for a few seconds. Maybe drink more fluids while you're sitting so that you have to get up and go use the restroom at least. There's ways to try to decrease the amount of prolonged sitting. And I think those are little steps that we can be doing that can be improving the health of the population.
Mm-hmm. Are there any new development in the field of research when it comes to bacterial colony and exosomes, which you talk about in the book, and their connection to obesity?
Yeah, so again, we constantly, it's constantly papers coming out. For example, we believe that physical activity is very important, but probably the biggest importance is cardiorespiratory fitness and muscular fitness. And you do probably get more fitness from doing some high intensity interval training. That means getting your heart rate high for at least a few minutes of the exercise, at least a few times per week. So somebody who's doing just a walk, if they could do a few minutes several times a week of speeding up the walk or maybe jogging for 2, 3, or 4 minutes during their walk to get their heart rate higher, that would even produce a better fitness than just the slow walk. Again, I do think there's a lot of fine tuning one can do with exercise to improve fitness and to improve muscular fitness. I do think the biggest problem we have, though, is just getting people to do some activity. I think you can, and again, I think trying to tell people they have to do a certain thing. I think that the best exercise for most people is the one that they're going to do. Telling somebody to go out and jog and they don't want to jog. Telling somebody they have to do a bicycle and they don't want to, so the best exercise, a lot of times that's what I'm asked. What is the best exercise? The best exercise is one that a person's going to do. And whether that's a walk or a jog or a swim or an aerobic dance or an elliptical machine, an exercise bicycle, a Nordic track. I mean, the best exercise for most people is the one that they like and they're going to do. And getting people to do some exercise is way better than no exercise.
Now, can we dive into just dieting? Because you kept repeating in the book that dieting alone is not going to get you anywhere, which brings us back to the importance of exercise. But are there any particular ways people go about dieting that you would like to either caution or inform or just educate some more about?
So I do think that there's no question that the sugar content, the carb content is too high. And unless somebody's doing heavy exercise, and if you're doing heavy exercise, taking in a little bit more sugars and carbs would be a good thing. For people, though, who are not doing a lot of physical activity and people who have higher blood sugars, higher triglycerides in the blood, they would certainly benefit by having lower sweets and simple sugars and even carbs in their diet. And they would do better if their diet was higher amounts of even fat, particularly if the fat is good fats, like nuts, like the fat from, olive oil, the fat from fish, monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fats. Nobody needs lard. Nobody needs, heavy amounts of all the bad saturated fats. But if somebody was having, for the typical diet, having a diet that's lower in simple sugars, lower in the carbs like bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, having more fruits, having more vegetables, having more unprocessed food, having more lean meats, particularly fish and lean, things like white meat of turkey, but even steak. Even having lean pieces of lean meat is better for most of the population than all the sweets and the carbs. And again, that's particularly the case for so many in our society whose weight is high and who have high sugars and high triglycerides. Again, I think it's the carbs are better. I do think if somebody wants to do many diets to lose weight, I don't think it really matters what diet they use because many diets will get you to lose weight if you stick to it. The problem for everyone, though, is that they, even if they do the diet for a month or 3 months or 6 months, they don't continue to do it for years and years. So you have to do something long term that's going to be, and so a person might not be able to be on Jenny Craig for their whole life, but they could be on Jenny Craig for 3 months or 6 months. And then if they tried to lower their sweets and carbs and exercise more, and again, even while they're losing weight, if they were doing physical activity, they might lose a little bit more weight. But then when they go off the diet, if the physical activity continues, that will help go a long way for preventing most of the regain of weight. And so I do think we're getting back over and over to physical activity. Maybe people say you are what you eat. I really believe it's very much more you are what your physical activity is.
Wow, this was an amazing sit down here. Thank you so much for all the information that you've taken the time to share with us. And I know we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that may be of importance that we haven't mentioned?
Yeah, I think, Lendo, again, the bottom line is getting the population to be more physically active, not only physical activity, aerobic exercise to improve the fitness, but also some muscular strength exercises to maintain muscle strength, particularly as one ages. I think lowering sugar and carbs in the diet is very important. And then for many people who are not doing this good enough, they can at least make sure they get their sugars treated and their lipids treated, and their blood pressure treated, because it's the cardiometabolic abnormalities that lead so much. Again, in a perfect world, I mentioned early and said several times, perfect world, everyone will remain lean, fit, aerobically and muscular fit from young age to old ages. And that's not what's happening. So at least if you gain weight over time, it would be better to gain some weight and maintain physical activity and fitness than vice versa, because I do think that the physical activity and fitness is even more important than the fat. But again, you also can get many of the metabolic conditions treated by your clinician, by your primary care, and by subspecialists, the sugars, the blood pressure, the lipids. We have very good, mostly generic therapies for many of those things now that are not that expensive. And so, at least it's not a hopeless situation for most of the population. Thank you, Lendo, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us here on the platform. Well, there you have it, folks. That was Dr. Carl Lavie. We will see you all on the next one here.
Okay, Lendo, it was a pleasure being with you.
That was great.
Yeah.